Everyone, welcome back to the channel. One of the most heartbreaking and poignant tales in 90 Day Fiancé's history is presented to you tonight. Brandon Gibbs and Julia Trubkina. In front of millions of viewers, two names that fans are familiar with have endured family strife, cultural conflicts, and love. However, their actual lives behind the cameras were much more difficult than anyone had thought. They struggled for years to keep their marriage intact by striking a balance between freedom and family and love and commitment. However, in the end, the battles became too intense. Heartbreak, demands, and accusations pushed them to make an impossible decision. And so, in a turn of events that left everyone in shock, family conflicts have been a long-standing issue for Julia Trubkina and her husband, Brandon Gibbs. They ultimately made the painful choice to sell their house and all of their other properties for $3 million. They made the decision to relocate to Canada and permanently leave the United States following the transaction. They also said at the same time that they would no longer be featured on TLC's 90 Day Fiancé show. Brandon Gibbs's mother was one of the primary causes of his family's strife. There were accusations that Julia Trubkina was mistreating her mother-in-law. Brandon Gibbs's mother told her son that she was upset about this. "Brandon, you are no longer my son as of right now if you do not file for divorce from your wife, Julia Trubkina. You will no longer be considered my child." Brandon was devastated to hear his mother say such hurtful things. He understood that the only way out, the purpose of this tumult, was to abandon everything. In an attempt to start over, he sold all he owned and relocated to Canada with Julia Trubkina. We reveal the whole journey tonight. This is more than simply a TV plot. It's a tale of tradition versus independence, love versus devotion, and the ultimate cost a couple must bear to preserve their union. You will never see Julia and Brandon the same way again after hearing what you are about to hear. Julia Trubkina's story began when she first came to the United States. Sounded like a fantasy. Brandon Gibbs, the quiet farm kid from Dinwood, Virginia, had captured the heart of a young Russian woman full of ambition, vigor, and resolve. Far from Brandon's family farm's fields and barns, their romance started online. In Julia's mind, America was a place of opportunity, adventure, and freedom. However, she discovered something rather different. She entered a world of early mornings, chicken coos, and, most importantly, a mother-in-law who would replace the skyscrapers and city lights, soon take over of every aspect of her life. Betty Gibbs, Brandon's mother, smiled as she greeted Julia. However, that smile was accompanied with unwavering authority, regulations, and expectations. Julia was instructed from day one on what she could do, where she may sleep, and how she was to act. Julia and Brandon were compelled to live in different rooms under Betty's roof, and even their intimacy as a pair was watched. Fans of 90 Day Fiancé had strong memories of the scenes. Betty's stringent rules and Julia's fiery personality clashed, causing her to become frustrated. Was a young lady who was trapped despite being in love, stuck in a country life she never wanted, stuck between her individuality as Julia and her identity as Brandon's wife, and in the shadow of her husband's parents. Brandon initially attempted to strike a balance. He complied with his parents' desires, put in a lot of work, and told Julia that things will improve. But the stress increased day by day. Julia was fighting more than simply the seclusion of the country and the farm work. She was fighting against the sensation that she wasn't really accepted. The murmurs began. Julia has little regard for her mother-in-law. Brandon is being transformed by Julia. She has no place here. Those murmurs quickly escalated into altercations. Julia was accused by Betty of being impolite, inconsiderate, and resistant to change. In response, Julia accused Betty of dominating their marriage, restricting her independence, and treating her more like an overstaying guest than like family. Being caught in the midst, Brandon had to endure the most agonizing test of his life. On one side was his mother, who brought him up, made sacrifices for him, and helped him navigate life. Julia, the woman he loved, the partner he chose, and the future he desired, was on the other. It was a conflict between his wife and his family, between the past and the present. Their marriage was becoming more and more strained. Arguments started to happen frequently. Thus became the norm. Julia frequently questioned whether her decision to immigrate to America had been a mistake. Meanwhile, Brandon pondered how long he could maintain both universes while lying awake at night. Together before to their downfall. Then the unimaginable occurred. Brandon's mother gave an ultimatum that would change everything one evening amid another tense family argument. Brandon, you are no longer my son as of right now if you do not get a divorce from Julia Trubkina. You will no longer be considered my child. Like a knife, those words lingered in the air. Julia's face went white. Brandon's heart was shattered. The person he believed would always be there for him, his mother, had just made him make a decision. Brandon realized then that something needed to change. But everyone would be shocked by what happened next. Like thunder, Brandon's mother's order reverberated throughout their lives. You will no longer be my son as of right now if you do not divorce Julia. Brandon saw those remarks as more than just a criticism of his marriage. They were a direct assault on his identity as a spouse, a man, and a son. He had consistently attempted to serve as a mediator between his wife and mother, hoping that the fissures would be softer with patience and time. However, the bridge had now fallen. With tears in her eyes, Julia asked the question that had been bothering her. How long can we continue to live this way, Brandon? Brandon was at a loss for words. He loved Julia as much as he loved his mother. However, he realized for the first time that he could no longer have both. The Gibbs home was a battleground of silence for weeks. Dinners were uncomfortable, conversations were chilly, and even small acts of kindness vanished. Julia pulled away. Within herself, daydreaming for hours about a life without having to struggle for acceptance. With a sad heart, Brandon roamed the property, again repeating his mother's command. Though they hardly discussed the future, they both realized that something had to give. With every day that went by, the burden of having to choose between freedom and family increased. After a particularly stressful supper one evening, Julia's eyes were fatigued as she gazed at Brandon. What if we simply departed? She muttered. Brandon blinked. Left. Indeed. Everything was left. The house, the conflicts, the farm. What if we started over somewhere far away and sold everything? A place where we are not told how to live by anyone. Brandon initially believed it was not feasible. The farm was his mother's kingdom, his father's pride, and the legacy of his family. It would be a betrayal of generations of labor as well as his parents. However, the concept grew stronger the more he considered it. For if a legacy meant losing his marriage, what good was it? If he lost the lady he loved, what good were possessions and land? The farm had never been Julia's home. She was now providing Brandon a key to the prison. Even the couple was taken aback by the property's value when they started looking into selling it. Offers started coming in because of the rising real estate market and the possibility for landholding for developers. Abruptly, numbers Julia had never imagined appeared on the table. $3 million. Money wasn't the only thing involved. 'Twas liberty. Enough to leave, begin new and don't turn around. Enough to put an end to the rumors, get away from the demands, and create a future that suits them. However, the choice was accompanied by guilt. Brandon was aware that it would be viewed as treachery by his parents. The Gibbs family's history was erased when they sold the house and the land. It meant severing connections with roots rooted in Virginia soil as well as with property. Brandon had trouble sleeping at night. He was caught between two unthinkable options as he gazed at the ceiling. Remain and give up his marriage or abandon his family and make sacrifices. The final explosive debate was the tipping point. Betty went up to Julia once more and accused her of destroying the family and controlling Brandon. Exhausted and enraged, Julia responded with unvarnished candor. Being treated like a servant is not why I came to America. To start a life with your son I came here. However, congratulations if destroying us is your goal. We can no longer live this way, so you've won. When Brandon heard Julia's voice falter, he understood that his beloved was at her breaking point. He would lose her forever if he didn't take action right away. Brandon consequently made the most drastic choice of his life at that precise moment. He glanced at his mother, then at Julia. The room fell silent as he calmly stated, "We're selling everything. The house, the land, all of it. Julia and I are leaving." The plate clattered beneath his father's fork. Brandon remained solid, his voice calm, his choice final, as Betty's eyes widened in disbelief. Inside, the process started after a few weeks. The property was inspected by realtors. Contracts were written and buyers toured the property. Strangers marveled over the fields that had been their prison, while Brandon and Julia observed. They held a $3 million check in their hands as the final deal was closed and the papers were signed. Julia grinned fearlessly for the first time in years. She saw freedom, not just statistics. Holding her hand, Brandon experienced relief and heartache. He was relieved to have chosen love. Sadness that he had transformed his. Returning to the family he once believed would never leave him. But now there was no turning back. The deal was more than a simple transaction. Their destination, a new nation, a new life, a place where they might at last breathe, was part of their escape plan. When Julia and Brandon faced reality, the sale papers' ink was only beginning to dry. In Virginia, they were no longer homeowners. The house that held decades of Gibbs family history, the fields and the farm, it had vanished. It was like breaking free from a chain for Julia that had kept her confined for years. She felt a strange sense of relief as she moved through the empty rooms, as if every box she packed would bring her one step closer to taking back her life. For Brandon, however, memories were spoken in every nook and cranny of the mansion. The barn he had toiled in since he was a lad, the family kitchen, and his childhood bedroom were more than simply wood and walls. They were aspects of who he was. And they were someone else's now. Julia remained steadfast when the moving trucks entered the driveway. "We're not only relocating houses," she informed Brandon. "We are relocating lives." Years' worth of possessions, pictures, and furniture were packed away. Julia only preserved a few mementos, clothing, personal belongings, and necessities. But Brandon hovered over everything, including his father's equipment, the old family photo albums, and even the shabby couch in the living room. It was more difficult for him to let go than he ever thought. But hesitation was not an option. They decided on a departure date. Their decision's news swiftly circulated around the community of 90-Day Fiancé fans. Rumors started to circulate. For what reason were Brandon and Julia selling their house? Were they getting a divorce? Did they have financial difficulties? Julia and Brandon jointly posted a statement on social media to quell the rumors. "We've made the decision to sell our house and start a new chapter in our lives after giving it much consideration. We will be beginning again in Canada after departing the United States. Additionally, this signifies that we are abandoning the 90-Day Fiancé. Although the voyage has been amazing, it's time for us to live our lives as we see fit." The post blew up. Supportive, horrified, and heartbroken remarks were all over the fans' pages. "I hope you find peace in Canada, but we'll miss you on the show. This is unbelievable. My favorite couple is you two. Keep your marriage intact and don't let anyone interfere. Remain resilient." However, there were detractors as well. Julia was accused by some of controlling Brandon. Others agreed with Betty, claiming that Julia had shattered the family. The dispute that had pushed them away was reflected in the online discussion. Julia didn't care though. She and Brandon were making their own decision for the first time. For love, not for the TV or family's expectations. Brandon tried one final time to make amends with his parents as the day of the move approached. In the hopes of a quiet farewell, he invited them to the almost deserted house. His father came silently and shook hands firmly, but Betty wouldn't budge. Brusquely, "You're making a mistake, Brandon," she added. "Julia has not won this. You've lost this." Brandon's chest constricted. Julia, standing next to him, whispered, "It's time to go. Mom, I'm choosing my wife. I'm choosing my marriage." "I thought you'd understand," but Betty turned away, refusing to meet his eyes. Suddenly, the last thread that bound Brandon to his mother broke. For Julia, the move was about more than just boxes and luggage. It was about dreams. She packed away her vision board, which was full of magazine cutouts of city skylines, cafes, and travel experiences. "In Canada we start over," she said, grinning at Brandon. The night before they left, they stood in the driveway one last time as the stars above the Virginia sky glimmered. The same stars that had watched over their first kisses, their arguments, and their vows. Brandon nodded, but he secretly questioned whether starting over would really make the pain of leaving his family behind go away. "Goodbye home," Brandon said almost to himself. Julia squeezed his hand. The morning they left, Julia shared a final picture of herself and Brandon standing with their suitcases, the old farmhouse in the background with a caption, "Sometimes you have to let go of the past to build the future." They had their tickets reserved, their bags packed, and $3 million secured. So they weren't just moving, they were reinventing themselves. Farewell, America. They then left the land, the house, the play, and the battle behind as they said, "Hello, Canada." The plane landed on a clear morning in Vancouver, with the mountains towering in the distance, the skies clear, and the air carrying a sharp chill unlike Virginia's humid warmth. "This is it," she said, smiling. It had almost destroyed them, but as they boarded the plane, they couldn't have known that the challenges ahead in Canada would test them in ways even harsher than before. Because leaving your country doesn't always mean leaving your problems. Our fresh start. Brandon nodded wearily, his eyes heavy from a restless journey. This wasn't just a fresh start for him, he mumbled. It was a risk. Canada was unknown and unproven. However, he recognized one thing as he saw Julia's eager expression. He had to share her belief that this dream was real. With hopes and bags, the couple entered Canada. Julia was instantly enthralled. The bustle of the city, the multicultural faces, and the streets' cleanliness. She had long yearned for life. As they were in a taxi, she asked Brandon, "Do you feel it?" "Feels like airborne freedom." Brandon forced a grin. It's different indeed. But he was deeply affected by the contrast. No barns, no familiar roads, no expansive fields. It wasn't Virginia. He wasn't certain that it would ever be home. Julia urged that they locate a location that represented their independence using their money cushion. They looked at apartments for days before deciding on a contemporary apartment with a view of the water. Wide-ranging views of the city skyline and the water were visible from the floor-to-ceiling windows. In the empty living room, Julia worked as her laughter reverberated. "Is this unbelievable? We own this. Just us, no farm, no parents." Brandon sat on the couch after dropping the baggage. He acknowledged that it's lovely, but his tone lacked the passion Julia was hoping for. He nevertheless signed the lease. It was a dream come true for Julia. It was a plunge into the unknown for Brandon. Even in Canada, they were unable to avoid the shadow of celebrity. Fan blogs and other outlets adopted their strategy, dubbed it the Great Escape. While some ridiculed their choice, others applauded their bravery. Julia embraced it by sharing glitzy images of their new condo, the cityscape, and their travels through Canada. Brandon posted less frequently and his photos were more muted, with one caption that said, "Love is worth everything." He was starting again in Canada. Coffee cups, peaceful strolls, and balcony views. He wasn't prepared to express his emotions to the world. Not quite yet. Although Canada forced adaptation, it also offered freedom. Eager to discover, Julia immersed herself in the beat of the city. She went to K, took exercise courses, and began connecting with influencers and other immigrants online. Every day she had more and more energy. But Brandon had trouble. It was a different job market. He felt uncomfortable in the fast-paced urban setting and found it difficult to translate his U.S. expertise. Returning to He was aware of his responsibilities as a farmhand and caregiver, Virginia. He was an outsider looking for meaning in Canada. Brandon moaned one evening when Julia was cooking dinner in their modern new kitchen. "Ever miss it?" he inquired. "What did you miss?" Julia answered. "My parents, the routine, the farm." Julia shook her head away from me after freezing. "Brandon, no. Being regarded like an outsider is not something I miss. Every day I don't miss battling. This is our proper place." As she clasped his hand, her tone softened despite the sharpness of her remarks. "We departed. For a cause. Remember that." They had protection but pressure thanks to the $3 million. Because they were concerned about depleting their assets, Brandon wanted to make cautious investments. Julia, on the other hand, had high dreams and lived a bold life, traveling and opening a dancing studio. One night she said, "Money isn't simply for safety. It's necessary for survival. Sitting in a condo and counting pennies is not why we traveled this far." Brandon's temples shook. "It's about lasting, not about pence. For not. Be cautious, this can vanish." Their new battlefield was the strain over money. They were no longer under Betty's shadow, but they still had to deal with their own conflicts. Adventure versus stability, independence versus security. They stood on their balcony and looked out at the city lights one cold evening. Julia's eyes were bright with resolve as she leaned against the railing. "Brandon," she said, "we made it. We made our escape. We made our own decision. I know it's difficult, but this is our opportunity to." After a long moment of silence, Brandon wrapped his arm around her and thought about his mother's ultimatum, the empty Virginia house, the angry words left behind, the weight of starting over, and the uncertainty of tomorrow. At last he whispered, "You're right. Write our story. Don't let fear stop us now." For Brandon, it was a pledge he wasn't sure how to fulfill, but for Julia, it was a reassurance that they were here and that I would strive to make this work. Because even though they had crossed boundaries, their real battle had only just begun. Julia's first few months in Canada were a blur. With the skyline at her doorstep and freedom in her hands, she felt alive in ways she had never experienced in Virginia. She started going to dance classes, rediscovering her love of movement, and soon she was sharing videos on social media, including short reels exploring Canadian culture through dance, lively clips in hip gyms, and choreographed routines against the harbor. As her followers cheered, "Go Julia! You deserve this. This is the real you, not stuck on some farm. Keep shining, queen." Every like, comment, and new follower fueled her ambition. Julia saw Canada not just as a home but as a stage. Brandon, on the other hand, felt like he was fading into the background while her followers followed her 90-day fiancé journey and watched Julia the dreamer, Julia the dancer, and Julia the woman free of farm fences. Thrived in the rhythm of the city. He floundered aimlessly, job applications went unanswered, networking felt alien, the hustle and bustle of the city drained him instead of energizing him. And in Virginia he was known as the dependable son, the hard-working farm hand, but in Canada he was just another face in the crowd, a man with no role and no roots. At night, he scrolled through old photos on his phone, the farm, the family get-togethers, and even the animals he used to care for. He didn't miss the fights, but he missed the fight stop belonging. One evening, Brandon forced a smile as Julia eagerly informed him about a local fitness influencer's offer of a collaboration. "That's great, babe," he said blankly. Julia paused in the middle of her sentence. "What's wrong?" "Nothin'." The more Julia embraced her new identity, the more Brandon felt left behind. She packed their calendar with parties, dance displays, influencer meetings, and city tours, but she could sense the emptiness in his voice. Brandon went because he was loyal, but he was clearly uncomfortable. He stood quietly in corners while Julia laughed with strangers, her confidence glowing, her energy electric. At times, he wondered if this was the woman he had married, or if Canada had created a new Julia he hardly recognized. Julia, however, became irritated with his hesitation, saying one night after a networking event, "You're always so quiet. Do you even want to be here?" "I don't know how to fit in here, Brandon. I feel invisible," I confessed. Julia crossed her arms. You're not invisible. You're staying in the background. I'm trying to build something, Brandon. Why can't you help me without dragging your feet? His silence hurt. Her ambition and his uncertainty couldn't be reconciled. Brandon's homesickness grew. He called his father from time to time, but the calls were short and tense, and his mother, still upset about his decision, wouldn't talk to him. You can always come back, his father said once, his voice low. This doesn't have to be forever. Brandon hung up, torn between relief at hearing his father's voice and guilt for leaving Julia in the life she fought so hard to build. Late at night, when Julia was asleep, Brandon would stand on the balcony staring at the stars. They were the same stars that shone over Virginia, yet they felt colder here. He whispered to himself, "What if I made a mistake?" In the meantime, Julia proceeded with, "We left everything behind for freedom," she reminded him, "and I'm not going to waste it sitting at home crying about the past." She began talking about opening her own dance and fitness studio, a place where she could combine her passion with business. She wasn't blind to Brandon's struggles, but she refused to let his doubts ruin her dreams. "Julia," he said cautiously, "it's dangerous to start a business here." She rolled her eyes and said, "We still don't fully understand how things work in Canada." The condo that once represented freedom now reverberated with silent tension and unspoken words. Julia stayed out later, pursuing her passions, while Brandon stayed home more frequently, withdrawing into solitude. Life is risk, Brandon. We didn't move across countries to play it safe. For Julia, Canada was possibility. For Brandon, it was uncertainty. We're together. Their talks frequently devolved into arguments about money, plans, and the life they were creating. One night, Julia finally lost it. "Do you even want to be here with me, Brandon, or would you rather go back to your mother and her farm?" Her words pierced deep. Brandon clenched his fists and spoke softly. "I left everything for you. Don't ever forget that." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument, and neither of them was prepared to give up, even though their relationship was beginning to deteriorate. The first snowfall in Vancouver painted the city in white. They were struggling to adjust. Julia loved Brandon despite her resentment of his hesitation, but love alone couldn't erase the doubts, the homesickness, and the growing distance between them. As Brandon clung to the past he couldn't let go of and Julia looked forward to a future of ambition and adventure, one truth became clear. Their escape from Virginia had freed them from family conflict, but it had also opened up new battles they never saw coming. "This is it," Julia said to Brandon over coffee one morning. "I'm going to open my own studio." Brandon blinked, his spoon hovering over his cereal. "A studio?" "Yes, a dance and fitness studio. Classes, workshops, events. I already found a space for Lee's downtown. It's perfect." Julia pressed her palms against the window of their condo, watching flakes drift down like tiny promises. For her, snow wasn't a reminder of cold, but rather a symbol of possibility. Brandon's stomach clenched. "Julia, we've only been here a few months. We don't even fully understand the taxes, the laws, starting a business now." "Cool. Could what? Fail. Everything in life can fail, Brandon, but if we don't try, we'll never know." Within weeks, Julia was engrossed in her new project, touring rental spaces, meeting with business advisors, and posting teasers about her upcoming Canadian chapter online, where her fans became more enthusiastic and supportive. She kept pushing forward with each update. "Yes, Queen, open that studio. This is the Julia we've been waiting for. Brandon better support you, girl." For once, she wasn't just the 90-day Fiancé star. She was a creator, a leader, and a businesswoman. However, the busier she got, the more she distanced herself from Brandon, who fell into loneliness as he applied for jobs, administrative work, retail positions, and even roles related to farming. He missed Virginia, despite its chaos, the routine, the familiarity, even the barn animals, but most of all, he missed feeling useful. In Canada, he felt like a ghost, Julia's shadow floating through a life that wasn't his. But nothing stayed. Every rejection eroded his confidence. At night, he lay awake next to Julia, staring at the ceiling while she dreamed of studios and success. Her computer. How did it go? She asked absently, and they replied, I don't have enough local experience. Julia hummed as she went through her emails. You'll find something soon. Her tone of dismissal was sharp, and Brandon wanted to yell at her how lost and invisible he felt, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead he muttered, I'm going for a walk, and slipped out into the chilly night, watching the neon-lit city streets as Brandon wandered. At the condo, Julia was still working, and she didn't notice the damp chill clinging to his fingers. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and hovered over his father's number. For a moment, he considered calling, but then he remembered his mother's ultimatum, the cutting words that had driven him here, and shoved the phone back into his pocket. He watched strangers laughing in cafes, couples holding hands, people hurrying with purpose. Everyone seemed to belong except him. They lived in different worlds, but they shared the same space. As Julia's studio dream became more real, the financial talks became more intense. The lease is expensive, Brandon said one evening, frowning over the figures. You're talking about renovations, equipment, marketing, Julia. This could eat through our savings fast. It's not just spending, it's investing. This is my chance, Brandon. Chance. Our chance, Brandon repeated. A week later, Julia hosted a small gathering at their condo. You think I don't see how miserable you are. You think I don't know you, Miss Virginia. But I can't build my life around your doubts. I need to build something real. The argument ended in silence, and Brandon withdrew to the bedroom. Because right now, it feels like it's just yours. Julia slammed her hand on the table. The room hummed with energy and laughter as Brandon stood in the corner with a glass of wine he hardly touched, feeling like an intruder in his own home. When Julia introduced him, it was brief and informal. This is my husband, Brandon. The conversations flowed past him, the focus firmly on Julia. For the first time, Brandon realized that he was no longer the star of their story. Julia was, and he wondered if she still required him at all. That evening, when the visitors had gone and the condo was silent, Brandon finally remarked, Julia, in a quiet voice, do you ever question whether I even belong here? She gave him a shocked expression. What are you saying? With your studio, your friends, and your following, are you creating your life in this city? I feel like I'm simply too much sometimes. Julia's remarks were harsh, yet her face softened. You're not over the top. My husband is you. But I can't hold back, Brandon. Just because you're afraid of my dreams. Brandon gave a nod. On the inside, though, the remarks simply made him more skeptical. Because the question that plagued him every day couldn't be answered by love alone. What future did he have if Julia was constructing hers here? At last the day came. With pride in her heart, Julia stood in front of her new dance and fitness facility. Bold letters glistened on the sign over the door. Julia Shifts. It was her. Planning, negotiating, and fantasizing for months had eventually came to be something tangible. Inside, students were greeted by racks of exercise equipment, polished flooring illuminated by brilliant lights, and mirrors lining the walls. Holding the keys in her shaking hands, she muttered, This is it, Brandon. Our future, Brandon forced a smile, is incredible, Julia. Really. The studio's big opening was a spectacle, with local influencers in attendance, music pulsing through the speakers, and Julia dazzled. However, beneath his smile was tiredness. Julia was in her element, radiant, self-assured, and unstoppable, while Brandon lingered at the back, passing out water bottles, wiping up sweat towels, and doing everything he could to avoid the spotlight. When one of her guests asked if he was an instructor, he chuckled awkwardly, saying, No, I'm just her husband. The words stung as they left his lips. Just her husband. Once he had been her. In the days that followed, Julia threw all of her energy into the studio, waking up early, staying late, and returning home buzzing with excitement about her expanding clientele. Brandon listened, but his responses became quieter. His days were empty, and his job search was still unsuccessful. One night, as Julia rattled off plans for a new workshop, Brandon finally interrupted, saying, "Julia, when was the last time we talked about us?" "What do you mean?" blinked. The silence that followed was heavier than words. "No," he said firmly. "I mean us, our marriage, our life, not just your studio." Julia put down her phone. "Brandon, this studio is our life. What's keeping us here, our future?" Brandon shook his head. "No, Julia, it's your future. Where do I fit in?" Brandon's loneliness grew as winter drew nearer. He had sacrificed his family, his home, and his roots for Julia, but now he wondered if Julia had sacrificed anything for him. One evening after another exhausting day at the studio, Julia returned home to find Brandon sitting in the dark, staring at nothing. "Why are you sitting like this?" he asked, replaying in his mind his mother's ultimatum. "If you don't divorce Julia, then from today you are no longer my son." "Because I don't know who I am anymore," he muttered, and Julia paused. "I used to," she said softly. "Know my place," Brandon added. "I played a part on the farm with my folks. I am nothing here. Julia Trubkina, the star of Julia Moves, is my wife." Julia's eyes softened as she sat next to him. "You're more than that, Brandon. My partner is you. My love is you." However, Brandon's voice broke. "What makes it feel that way, then?" Their largest disagreement to date broke out from the chat. "I left everything for you," Brandon said. "My house, my family." Julia retorted. "My history, and now I don't even recognize my life. I don't recognize me." "And what about me, Brandon? I left my country, my family, and my culture for you. Don't you dare act like I haven't sacrificed anything. The difference is I'm trying to build something out of it. You're just stuck in the past." They slept in silence that night, with Julia curled on one side of the bed and Brandon staring at the ceiling on the other. The space between them felt like a canyon, and Brandon's mind raced. Should he go back to Virginia, try to patch things up with his parents, or was Canada truly his home? If you can't see a future here, then maybe you need to decide what you really want. Brandon looked at her, his chest heaving. The studio had given her wings, but in doing so, had it left Brandon behind? If so, could their love endure the growing distance between them, even under the same roof? The tension in their condo lingered like a heavy fog as Julia clutched her pillow, wondering if she had pushed too hard, too fast. She wanted success, yes, but not at the expense of her marriage. But something deep down she feared was already too late. The warmth that once characterized their marriage now flickered like a dying flame. Brandon sat at the kitchen table one chilly February morning, staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button, his father's number glowing on the screen. Julia walked in, still glowing with energy from an early dance class. They ate meals in silence, their conversations reduced to small talk and logistics. "We're filming a promo today, so you should stop by the studio," she remarked with a smile. "Video? I might be busy." Brandon didn't look up. "I might be busy." Julia scowled. "Busy with what?" He put the phone down at last, his voice flat. "Maybe I'll call my dad. See how things are back home." Her heart skipped. "Back home? You mean Virginia?" Brandon nodded, avoiding eye contact. Later that night, Brandon revealed what had been bothering him. "I think about Virginia all the time," he said, sitting on the edge of their bed. Was familiar. Belonged there. Julia's chest constricted. "Brandon, we left for a reason. Do you forget how your mom treated me? Do you forget the ultimatum?" "I haven't forgotten," he said quietly, "but sometimes I wonder if we made the wrong decision." The words cut through Julia's heart. She had built everything, their home, their new life, and their studio, on the assumption that they had made the right decision, and now Brandon was tearing at the very foundation of it all. The days that followed were tense, became more reserved, aloof, and frequently disappeared for extended walks around the city. Fearful of losing him, Julia became more abrasive, her words laced with desperation. One night she snapped, "Do you want to throw away everything we've built here?" Brandon's voice rose. "What life, Julia?" "Life. Because I don't see where I fit in anymore." Her eyes were filled with tears. "You fit with me. Always with me. Isn't that enough?" But for Brandon it wasn't. To date, Canada had only taken away his sense of identity, purpose, and belonging. One afternoon, as the water rippled, gulls circled overhead, and the cold air pricked his cheeks, Brandon took out his phone and dialed his father's number. This time his father answered. "Brandon." His father's voice broke with emotion. "It's good to hear from you." They talked for almost an hour about the farm, the changes back home, and how much he was missed. His father said softly, "You can always come back. The door is open." Brandon's heart acted when he hung up, remembering all he had lost and all he still desired. That evening, Julia saw his aloof expression and couldn't contain herself any longer. "Are you leaving me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Brandon turned to her startled. "What? No, that is not what I said. But you're considering it. In your eyes I see it. You're not present. No longer." Julia's cheeks were wet with tears. "Don't do this, Brandon. Keep your mother from winning. Don't let what she says ruin us. For love we sacrificed everything. Don't discard it." Brandon clenched his throat. He detested witnessing her sob. Even though he detested the idea of hurting her, he was unable to ignore the knowledge that was inside of him. He said, "I don't know what I want anymore." Long after midnight, Julia sat on the balcony, unable to sleep. City lights glistened, taunting her with their brightness. She gripped her phone and looked through old pictures. Before the wars took over, they laughed in Virginia, were married, and moved into their first apartment. "We can't lose each other. Not now. Not like this," she muttered into the night, and Julia vowed the next morning she would assist Brandon in locating his place in Canada. She refused to let her marriage be ruined by homesickness. However, when she saw his weary eyes and empty grin across the breakfast table, she came to the realization it wouldn't be simple to save them. Because Julia was afraid for the first time that love might not be sufficient. Unspoken comments hung thick in the air of their condo. As Julia battled valiantly to prevent their marriage from failing, Brandon sailed through the days like a shadow. Every morning, she observed him loitering by the window, gazing vacantly at the bay. She could feel him turn away in bed every night, as if the tempest blazing inside him could be protected by distance. Last one night, the silence was broken by Brandon. He whispered, "Julia," and her heart tightened. "I don't know if I can do this anymore." "What are you going to do? Do you live this way? Be present. Act as though I belong when I don't." They stung like daggers. Julia's mouth quivered. Brandon did not immediately respond to the question. "So, what are you saying? You want to leave me? You want to go back to Virginia?" No confession could have overshadowed his quiet. Brandon gave his father another call the next day. He inquired about the farm, regarding the animals, the seasons. His father's words were tentative but loving. "Your mother still feels betrayed," his father said. "However, things change with time. Perhaps, just possibly, things could become better if you returned." Home was more alluring to Brandon than before. No matter how far he ran, the soil of Virginia called to him because it was in his blood. He then turned to look at Julia, who was rushing about the condo with new studio blueprints flashing on her laptop. She had a determined look in her eyes. He questioned whether he could truly give up her goals for the security of his past while she was constructing a future here. Julia sensed his loosing hold and took action. She would give Brandon a feeling of purpose if Canada wasn't already providing it. At the dinner table one evening, she set a folder in front of him. Brandon said, "What's this?" to Wiry. "Your future," was Julia's resolute response. "A business consultant I spoke with suggested that we build a second studio location that would be dedicated to." Brandon's throat tightened as he opened the folder, which contained sketches, business plans, and even mock-up logos for Farm Strong Fitness by Brandon Gibbs. Strength training, farming-style workouts. "Your idea, your vision." Brandon blinked in shock. Julia, you did this without telling me because you won't fight for yourself. He snapped. So I'm fighting for you. You don't have to go back to Virginia to find purpose. We can build it here together. Hope was quickly overtaken by fear. This is too much, Brandon muttered, closing the folder. A business. Me. Julia, I can't even land a job interview here. How could I run something like this? Said Brandon. Because you're stronger than you think. You worked on a farm your whole life. Discipline. Hard work. That's what people need. You just don't see it yet. Julia fiercely grabbed his hand. And away. Or perhaps you simply don't want to acknowledge that I don't belong here. Julia's voice broke. No, Brandon. I don't want to acknowledge that you don't belong with me. Her tears fell, and for the first time in months, Brandon saw the fear in her eyes. Not of failing, but of losing him. That night, unable to sleep, Brandon sat on the balcony with the folder on his lap and the city illuminating the surroundings. He opened it again, examining the words, the sketches, and the opportunities. Could this be his path? Could this be the bridge between who he was and who he needed to become? Julia joined him quietly, putting a blanket around his shoulders. I don't want to lose you, she whispered. Brandon looked at her. His heart divided between two worlds. Then help me find myself here. For the first time in weeks, Julia smiled through her tears. Although the decision was not final, something had changed. Brandon no longer felt like a ghost floating through Canada. For the first time, he saw a way forward. Uncertain, terrifying, but possible, and Julia, holding his hand beneath the stars, knew that if they could survive this storm, they could survive anything. However, as dawn broke, one thing was certain. The decision was still up ahead. Would Brandon accept a new identity in Canada, or would the pull of Virginia eventually pull him back? Only time will tell. By summer, fans, bloggers, and even gossip sites were following Julia and Brandon closely, and they were no longer just unknown newcomers to Canada. The headlines boldly depicted their lives. 90-day fiancé couple reinvents themselves in Canada. Julia Trubkina's Tubio booms while Brandon struggles farm strong fitness reality star turned trainer. The attention was unrelenting, with thousands of comments on every post Julia made and debates sparked by every picture of Brandon teaching at his classes. One night, as Julia scrolled through her notifications, she smiled at the praise. Look at this, Brandon. People love what we're doing. They're calling us inspiring. Critics ripped them apart, while supporters applauded their bravery. For Brandon, the attention was fuel, and for Julia, it was fire burning at the edges of his brittle confidence. However, Brandon scowled at the screen, and what about the comments that said, I look miserable. They don't know us. Don't let them tell you that I should have left you months ago. Julia's smile wavered. Brandon's chest tightened as his father called late one evening. His voice warm but laden with hesitation. Your mother wants to see you. Brandon froze. See me after everything. She's still angry, son. But she's your mother. However, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that strangers define you because the words cut too close to the truth, and he feared that perhaps people saw something in him that he couldn't admit out loud. He hung up, and Julia saw his disturbed expression right away. Part of him wished for reconciliation, but another part understood that Julia would perceive this as treachery. Who was it? After everything she said, Julia's eyes darkened. She's still my mother, Julia, Brandon muttered. My dad, he continued. Mom wants to see me. Her voice rose. No, she's the lady who urged you to divorce me or lose her forever. And you're not just choosing between us and your mom, Julia said one night, her voice shaking. You're choosing between the past and the future, Brandon shot back. And what if I don't see a future? Julia felt betrayed, as though all her sacrifices were being erased by one phone call from Virginia. You're not just choosing between us and your mom, Brandon said. You're choosing between the past and the future. As if their private turmoil wasn't enough, the words broke her. The media learned of the Virginia call, and somehow a blogger reported that Brandon was thinking about going back to the U.S. Headlines exploded. Is Brandon leaving Julia for his mother? 90-day fans. The couple is on the brink of disintegration. Julia's phone was constantly buzzing with messages from fans. Please don't let him go back. Fight for him. If Brandon leaves, it would prove Betty was. Stay strong, Julia. Don't let your marriage fall apart. For Julia, the public scrutiny felt oppressive, and their private squabbles were now everyone's amusement. One stormy evening, Brandon sat by the window, staring at the rain streaming down the glass, while Julia stood behind him, arms crossed, her voice chop. Tell me the truth. Are you going back? Brandon turned, his eyes tired. I don't know. The words landed like a bomb, and Julia's face crumpled. Then what are we even doing here, Brandon? Why did we leave? I don't know who I am without Virginia, without my family, without home. Then make me your home. Isn't that what marriage is? Isn't that why we gave up everything? For a long time the room was silent, the rain hammering harder as if echoing their chaos, until Brandon whispered, I don't know if love is enough anymore. Julia's heart broke at the words. America? He asked, his voice cracking. They were at a crossroads, not only because they slept in different rooms for the first time since coming to Canada, but also because they lost Brandon. Brandon, alone in the guest room, stared at the ceiling while his father's voice echoed in his mind, drawing him back to Virginia, but also because Julia's tears reminded him of the woman who sacrificed everything to be by his side. This night, they slept in separate rooms for the first time since coming to Canada, and Julia lay awake, her mind racing with fear. Julia stared at her reflection in her studio mirror, her eyes blurred by tears, wondering if they would choose each other or if the weight of the world would tear them apart. She had fought for months for their marriage and their future in Canada, but Brandon's silence and uncertainty had driven her to the brink. This can't be the end, she said. Not after everything they had endured. Not after selling the farm, leaving Virginia, and starting over. Julia was determined to bring Brandon back into their shared world, so she planned a huge community event. A joint showcase that combined her dance studio and Brandon's Farmstrong fitness program. It will remind him of who we are together, and it will demonstrate that we can create something that is united rather than divided, she told herself. Flyers were distributed throughout the city, and advertisements were posted on social media, promoting the event as a celebration of movement with Julia and Brandon, but Julia didn't disclose the full scope to Brandon. In the meantime, Brandon carried a secret of his own. After weeks of silence, he had replied to his father's message, I'm thinking of coming back, which terrified him as soon as he hit send. However, a part of him longed for closure, for one last confrontation with his mother. He didn't tell Julia, knowing it would break her. She wanted it to be a surprise, a grand gesture to show him that their future wasn't in Virginia or in the past, but right here together. On the night of the showcase, hundreds gathered at the rented hall, music pulsing, lights flashing, and energy filling the air as Julia dazzled with her dance troupe. Her movements precise and elegant, the crowd roaring with applause. Then it was Brandon's turn, nervous but steady, leading a farm strong. He lay awake dreaming of two possibilities. Staying in Canada with Julia or flying to Virginia to face the woman whose ultimatum had changed everything. Maybe I need to see her, he thought to himself. Demonstration, explaining to the audience how strength training was inspired by farm work. To his surprise, the audience relished it. As they lifted hay bale props, carried weighted buckets, and fiercely imitated barn chores, Brandon felt alive for a moment. He looked out at Julia, who was grinning proudly, her eyes pleading with him to see what she saw. A man with a purpose standing next to her, not behind her. When the event came to an end, Julia dragged him into a corner. Do you see now? He wanted to believe her that Canada could be home, but his phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from his father. Your mother is ready to see you. Come home. Brandon's heart pounded. Julia's arms were wrapped around him, but his father's words wrapped around his soul. Brandon, this is us. This is what we can build together. Don't let Virginia take you away from this. Her words struck hard, and the applause was still echoing in his ears. Brandon said, I can't move forward until I face her, until I hear from her directly. Her eyes were burning with rage. She told you to divorce me. She disarmed you. And now you want to go crawling. Julia, what if I went back just for a little while to see my mom? To get closure? She asked, her fork clattering against the plate. Or are you just looking for an excuse to run back to her? It's not like that, he said quickly. He lowered his gaze and said, that's why I need to go to find out for sure if Virginia still has a hold on me or if my home is really here with you. Julia's chest constricted as she realized she was fighting against the ghost of his mother, not just for his love. That night, she sat up long after Brandon had gone to sleep, gazing out the window with the city lights reflecting in her eyes, knowing she couldn't stop him if he really decided to. The condo was silent the following morning, but Brandon's mind roared like a storm as his father's message, "Your mother is ready to see you. Come home," replayed endlessly. For months, he had been torn between two worlds. The uncertain new life Julia had built in Canada and the life he had left behind in Virginia. However, she also knew that if he left, there was no guarantee he would return. Her heart whispered a single question into the silence. If he goes to Virginia, do I lose him forever? We built a life here. Built a life here. Brandon swallowed his heart. Then at least I'll know. I can't keep living in this limbo. Tears welled in Julia's eyes as he packed a small overnight bag. What are you doing? She asked, and he froze. Julia, I need to go just for a week to see them. To see her? She cracked. And what if a week becomes forever? What if you go there and realize you never should have left? Then stay, she pleaded. Stay with me. Choose me, not her. But her plea only made his suffering worse. Later that afternoon, Brandon went outside and called his father. Dad, I don't know if I can do this, he confessed. If you walk out that door, you're not just visiting your mom. You're putting our marriage on the line. Brandon dropped the bag to the floor. His heart ached at the sight of her shaking hands. Remained unwavering. This isn't about picking between your mother and your wife, son. It's about making your own peace. Do it if seeing her makes you feel at ease. His father said firmly, don't mistake closure for happiness. Sometimes the past doesn't heal. It just reopens old wounds. Brandon closed his eyes and said, if it tears you apart, then stay where you are. What if I lose Julia? Then you'll lose the best thing you ever had, his father said. He discovered Julia packing her own bag in the unit. What are you doing? If you're going to Virginia, then I'm coming with you, he said, startled. She wiped away her tears. Brandon's eyes widened. Julia, no. You and my mom. I don't care. Julia interrupted. If you think you need to face her, then we face her together. I'm not staying behind, waiting to see if you come back. Her voice was fierce, her determination unwavering, and for the first time, Brandon realized that Julia was no longer afraid of Betty. Brandon looked at her unsure. Are you sure? Because if we go back, it won't be easy. She'll say things. She'll try to break us again. Julia's grip tightened on his hand, and Brandon studied her face. That night, they sat side by side on the balcony, the cool air heavy with unspoken words. Maybe this is the only way, Julia whispered. Maybe we need to confront her together once and for all. Brandon's chest tightened with fear, anticipation, and resolve as Julia clicked, confirm. They weren't going back to live, they weren't going back to surrender, they were going back to face the past, to face the ultimatum that had haunted them, and they were going back to reclaim their life after they had endured mockery for him and created a life out of nothing. All right, he said. Last we'll go together. The following morning they booked tickets to Virginia. The plane landed in Virginia under gray skies, and as soon as he stepped off the jet bridge, Brandon felt his stomach twist. The smell of the humid summer air, the familiar landscape outside the airport windows. It was like stepping into a past life he wasn't sure he wanted to relive. Julia whispered to Brandon as she zipped her suitcase. This is it, the final test. Brandon nodded. His eyes steady for the first time in months, and we'll face it together. Brandon nodded, though his palms were sweating, and his father picked them up in silence as the old pickup truck rattled down familiar country roads, and Brandon stared out at the fields, his memories flooding back with each step. "Mom knows you're coming," his father finally said. "And she's not happy, but she agreed to see you. Remember," she whispered. "We came here together. We leave here together." Brandon did not return the squeeze, and when they pulled into the driveway, Brandon froze. The Gibbs family home was there, just as he remembered it, with a porch swing, the well-kept bushes, and the smell of hay, but it was no longer home. Betty Gibbs stood at the doorway, her arms crossed, her face as stern as ever. "Brandon," she said icily. "You came." Her lips tensed as her gaze shifted to Julia. "And you brought her." "Yes, I am his wife," she said, straightening her shoulders. Brandon's jaw tightened. "Mom, I didn't abandon anyone. I chose my marriage." The home felt like a museum of Brandon's early years, with family photos lining the walls and the same furniture filling the living room, but the warmth was gone. Betty didn't waste any time. "So, you've built your new life in Canada, abandoned your family, abandoned your roots for her." The room shook with silence as Julia said, "I'm not a stranger over your mother, over the people who raised you. I'm not a stranger. I'm his wife. And maybe if you had treated me like family, none of this would have happened." Betty's eyes blazed. "You poisoned him against us. You turned him into someone I don't recognize." Julia leaned forward. "No, I helped him become someone who doesn't bow down to ultimatums." "Stop," he said firmly, his voice louder than he intended. "Mom, I love you, but Julia is my wife, and if you can't accept her, then you don't accept me." Betty's face hardened. But something changed here in the house where he had once been just a boy under his mother's thumb. "You actually prefer her to your own family, then?" "I'm choosing love," Brandon said, his voice breaking but his will unwavering. "Peace is what I'm going for." Julia put a calm hand on Brandon's shoulder and said, "We didn't come here to fight, so maybe I don't belong here anymore if you can't see that. We came here to demonstrate our strength as a team. You will respect our marriage even if you don't like me." Betty's eyes were flaming with hurt and pride as she remained silent for a long time. She turned away at last, her voice acrid. "Don't expect me to celebrate if you do what you want." Brandon and Julia spent the evening in a hotel in the area. Brandon's heart was heavy as he gazed at the ceiling while they laid in bed. "That was more difficult than I anticipated," he said, as Julia turned to face him with gentle eyes. "But you succeeded. You defended us." With a trembling breath, Brandon said, "You truly choose us for the first time. So why does it still seem like I lost something?" "Because you did, but sometimes you have to lose the past to protect the future." Julia gave him a gentle kiss on the hand. As the lights went down, Brandon came to the realization that truth. The ultimatum had left a wound too deep, but for the first time he felt lighter. He had faced the Virginia battlefield and left with Julia's hand still in his, but the question now was whether that hand, that love, would be strong enough to carry them back to Canada, and they were still struggling to build. The flight back to Canada was quiet, with Brandon sitting by the window, gazing down at the clouds, and Julia leaning against her seat, lost in. For the first time, Brandon had fully and genuinely confronted his mother and chosen Julia, but the decision still weighed heavily. He had defended his marriage, but in doing so, he had closed a door on the family that had raised him. When the plane landed, Julia whispered, "We're home." Brandon nodded slowly. The encounter with Betty had left scars, but it had also brought clarity. It was the place they had created together, not the farm. And perhaps, just perhaps. But peace didn't erase the cracks. Their marriage had endured months of silence, distance, and identity battles. One confrontation couldn't undo all of that. Julia and Brandon both knew it. One night, while eating dinner together, Julia said softly, "We can't keep living like we're on two separate paths." Life felt oddly calm again at their condo. Brandon walked through the rooms with a lighter step, no longer bound by the guilt of unfinished business in Virginia. "This to work, we need to rebuild together." Brandon looked into her eyes and said, "I know, and I want to try. Really try." Brandon returned to farm-strong fitness with newfound vigor, and his classes grew steadily as more people signed up each week. He was now teaching resilience instead of just strength. Strength isn't just about muscles, he told a class one evening. It's about knowing who you are, even when the world tries to break you. Despite the fact that her studio was doing well, Julia decided to cut back on her schedule to spend more time with Brandon. "Success doesn't mean anything if I use you," she said one night, as Brandon kissed her forehead. "And I don't want to lose us either." Julia watched from the back of the room, feeling her heart swell. She saw not just her husband but the man she had always believed he could be. Compromise, his ambition softening, his confidence growing, but it was the kind of balance they had needed all along. Nevertheless, the shadow of Virginia remained. Betty never called, wrote, or inquired. Her father called occasionally to provide updates on the farm. The silence was painful, but Brandon refused to let it define him. One evening he told Julia, "I can't change her," but he could choose not to allow her to control him any longer. Julia squeezed his hand, and that was sufficient. On their anniversary, "We've been through hell, Brandon. But we're still here, still together. Maybe that's our strength." Brandon grinned faintly. "Then maybe it's time we stop surviving and start living." "It's not to replace the first one," he said softly, holding out a small box containing a new ring. "It's not to replace the first one," he said, referring to the small candle dinner that Julia had prepared for him at the condo. The night ended with warmth, laughter, and a promise. Not of perfection but of tenacity, that despite family conflicts, ultimatums, and the possibility of losing everything, they were still standing together. Canada wasn't the home they had left behind, and Virginia wasn't the dream they had dreamed of, but together, they had carved out a place for themselves. "Matter where we go, Virginia. Canada, anywhere, I choose you." Julia's eyes welled with tears as she put the ring on her finger. Something genuine. And for the first time in a long time, Julia and Brandon felt like partners again, but also like survivors. Months went by, and life in Canada finally started to feel stable. In the local dance community, Julia's studio grew and became a well-known brand, and Brandon's Farmstrong Fitness gained a devoted following of customers who appreciated his honesty and perseverance. For the first time since leaving Virginia, the couple wasn't just surviving, they were thriving. Canada wasn't just Julia's dream anymore. It was gradually becoming his as well. However, just as they were getting used to their routine, a new opportunity presented itself. A Canadian reality TV producer reached out, intrigued by their story, and offered them a chance to star in a new show. The condo, which had previously been filled with tension and silence, now echoed with laughter once more. They cooked meals together, spent weekends exploring the city, and even took quick trips to the mountains and coast. "It's not 90-Day Fiancé," the producer assured. "This would be your story told on your terms." Julia's eyes glowed at the prospect, seeing it as an opportunity to share their story, to inspire others, and to reclaim their narrative. However, Brandon froze. The cameras, the spotlight, the scrutiny, it was everything they had left behind. "Do we really want to go through that again?" he inquired, and Julia's enthusiasm waned. "This time, Brandon. We'd be in charge this time." The offer made them face a new dilemma. Were they prepared to let the outside world back into their life, or would doing so jeopardize the delicate balance they had established? "Whatever we decide, I want us to decide it together. No more me versus you, just us." Brandon kissed her forehead, and as the city lights sparkled below, Julia rested against his shoulder as they sat on their balcony one evening. Their love had survived storms that could have destroyed anyone else, but the future, with its opportunities, challenges, and temptations, was still unwritten. As a result, Julia and Brandon stand at the brink of a new chapter. Will they return to the cameras and share their journey with the world, or will they protect the fragile peace they've built in Canada? Can their marriage hold up under new circumstances? Opportunities, or will fame test their love once more after everything they've given up? Is this really their happily ever after, or is this just the start of another storm? Only time will tell. Stay tuned because Julia and Brandon's story is far from over.